The clang of metal echoed in the sterile white chamber. Jax tightened his grip on the worn leather duffel, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't claustrophobic, not usually, but the tiny capsule felt like a metal coffin hurtling towards an unknown fate. This was it. No trial, no appeals. Just a one-way ticket to the Andromeda, Earth's newest space prison. The journey was a blur of flickering lights, recycled air, and the constant hum of the engines. The other inmates, a motley crew of hardened criminals and petty thieves, filled the communal area with a tense silence. Days bled into weeks, punctuated by the mealy rations and the suffocating boredom. Jax found solace in watching the endless black canvas of space dotted with twinkling stars, a stark contrast to the grimy streets he used to call home. Finally, a deep rumble announced their arrival. The Andromeda, a hulking mass of metal against the inky blackness, loomed large. Docking was a violent affair, the ship shuddering as they connected. Armed guards, clad in black bodysuits, herded them off the transport and into the prison. The sterile white hallways of the Andromeda were a reminder of their confinement. Their cramped cells were furnished with a cot, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a screen displaying a pre-recorded warden's welcome. It was a chilling reminder of their powerlessness. Life on the Andromeda was a monotonous routine. Days began with a protein bar breakfast and a forced hour of exercise in a zero-gravity gym. Work came next, either in the hydroponics bay, growing food under harsh artificial lights, or in the asteroid mining simulations, preparing for a future that seemed more and more like a threat. The nights were the worst. Trapped in their tiny cells, the silence amplified every creak and groan of the aging ship. It was during these nights that Jax befriended Han, a young hacker whose crime was stealing from the wrong corporation. They shared stories, dreams of freedom that seemed more like fantasies with each passing day. One evening, during a meal break, whispers of a rebellion began circulating. A charismatic figure named Razor, a notorious hacker with a titanium jaw, was rallying the inmates. He promised escape, a chance to carve out a life on a rogue asteroid colony. Hope, a flickering ember, rekindled in Jax's chest. The plan was audacious. Razor planned to hack into the ship's control systems during a mandatory zero-G basketball game, creating a diversion while a small group disabled the security grid. Jax knew the risks, but the prospect of freedom was too tempting to resist. The game was a tense affair. Bodies soared through the air, the ball bouncing erratically under the harsh lighting. In the chaos, Razor, a blur of movement, slipped into the control room. A tense silence followed, broken only by the muffled sounds of a struggle. Then, the lights flickered and died. Pandemonium erupted. Guards grappled with inmates, the metallic clang of batons echoing through the hallways. In the darkness, Jax made his way to the assigned section, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He fumbled with the security panel, hands slick with sweat. A click. The door slid open, revealing Han, his face pale. They sprinted towards the escape pods, dodging guards and the frantic shouts of the warden. The pod bay was a battleground. With a desperate lunge, Jax shoved Han into a pod, the hatch hissing shut. He turned, looking for his own escape, but the way was blocked by a hulking guard. A brutal fight ensued. Jax, fueled by a desperate need for freedom, landed a lucky punch, sending the guard reeling. He sprinted towards the nearest pod, slamming the hatch shut just as the guard lunged. With a deafening roar, the pod blasted off, throwing him against the padded wall. He looked back once, watching the Andromeda shrink into a speck against the vast canvas of space. He didn't know where he was going, or if he'd survive, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sliver of hope. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was an astronaut, hurtling towards the unknown. Meanwhile, Han's pod landed on a desolate asteroid, its surface riddled with craters. With a pounding heart he stepped out, the silence broken only by the hiss of his suit's oxygen supply. He was alone, stranded on a barren rock, but he was free. Jax's pod spun wildly, a metallic coffin caught in a cosmic ballet. Disoriented, he fought nausea, his vision swimming with the flashing red emergency lights. The control panel displayed a frantic message: critical engine failure. Panic clawed at his throat, but years of hustling on the streets had honed his survival instincts. He forced himself to focus. The pre-recorded escape pod manual flickered to life. His limited education kicked in: thrusters, oxygen levels, emergency beacon. He needed a course correction, but to where? His mind raced. He remembered Razor mentioning a rogue asteroid colony called Freedonia, a lawless haven for escaped criminals. A long shot, but it was his only hope. He punched in the coordinates, his fingers shaking. The pod lurched, fuel reserves dwindling. He spent the next agonizing hours staring at the endless black, praying for a miracle. Just as the thin line between hope and despair threatened to snap, a faint blip appeared on his radar: a derelict mining vessel. Jax's heart pounded. It was a gamble, but anything was better than hurtling towards an icy oblivion. He maneuvered the pod closer, the vessel a rusted hulk against the backdrop of stars. Docking was a nerve-wracking affair, the pod shuddering violently against the docking bay. He took a deep breath and opened the hatch. The stale air reeked of oil and dust. The ship was eerily silent. Cautiously, he ventured into the labyrinthine corridors, his headlamp casting long, eerie shadows. The vessel seemed abandoned, remnants of a hasty evacuation scattered around, half-eaten meals, tools left mid-work. Suddenly, a flicker of movement at the end of the corridor. Jax froze, adrenaline jolting through his system. He gripped the makeshift weapon he'd fashioned from a broken metal bar during his escape. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and wiry, with a wild mane of crimson hair and eyes that glinted in the lamplight. Jax tensed, prepared for a fight.
"Easy there, space drifter. Looks like we both had a rough landing,"
the figure said, her voice surprisingly calm. She introduced herself as Lyra, a smuggler who'd been caught in an asteroid storm. Her ship was beyond repair, but she had a functioning escape pod and a desperate need for a pilot. Jax saw his chance. Freedom, or so it seemed. He laid out his story: the rebellion, Freedonia. Lyra listened intently, a flicker of interest sparking in her eyes.
"Freedonia, huh? Haven't been there in a while, but they might take a chance on a skilled pilot. Just keep one thing in mind: freedom comes at a price."
Their partnership was forged out of necessity. Jax, driven by a desire for a new life, repaired the escape pod while Lyra scavenged the derelict vessel for supplies. They made the jump to Freedonia with a shared sense of anticipation and trepidation. The asteroid colony was a chaotic sprawl, a patchwork of ramshackle buildings clinging precariously to the rock face. Landing was a chaotic affair, dodging rogue drones and scavenging shuttles. As they touched down, the harsh reality of their new home hit Jax. This wasn't paradise. It was a desperate haven for the ostracized and the lawless. Lyra, however, seemed right at home. She quickly navigated the bustling marketplace, haggling with grizzled miners and shady figures in dark corners. Jax, however, felt out of place. The constant tension, the underlying fear, felt suffocating. He longed for the quiet desperation of his cell on the Andromeda, where at least he'd known the rules. As they sat around a flickering fire in a makeshift tavern, Jax overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. The topic was Razor. Razor, hailed as a hero back on the Andromeda, was now a ruthless warlord on Freedonia, using his hacking skills to enslave miners and control the black market. Disbelief turned to anger. Jax had risked everything for this man, for a dream of freedom that was a twisted reflection of reality. He slammed his mug on the table, the sound drawing curious stares. He had to warn someone, anyone, of the monster Razor had become. Lyra, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity.
"They say there's a resistance brewing. People who remember what freedom really means. You could warn them,"
she said, her voice low. In the dim, smoky tavern, Jax huddled with Lyra, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Details about the resistance were scarce. Whispers of hidden bunkers, coded messages exchanged in the bustling marketplace. It was a clandestine operation functioning beneath Razor's iron fist. Lyra, ever the resourceful smuggler, had connections. She knew a backwater bar frequented by disgruntled miners, a place where whispers of rebellion tended to gather. Jax, apprehensive yet determined, agreed to infiltrate the bar and seek out the resistance. The bar was a fetid den, filled with the stench of stale ale and desperation. Jax, disguised in a scavenged miner's helmet and worn cloak, navigated the throng of burly men, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He caught snippets of conversation, complaints about harsh quotas, Razor's iron-fisted control, and a flickering hope for a better tomorrow. His target was a wiry, one-eyed man nursing a mug at the corner table. The man, scarred and weathered, exuded a quiet intensity. Jax, his voice barely above a whisper, revealed his identity and his knowledge of Razor's true nature. The man listened intently, skepticism etched on his face. "Prove it," the man growled, his voice gravelly. Jax knew his only proof was his word. Yet, he recounted the details of the rebellion plan on the Andromeda, details only someone who was actually there could know. The man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition passing through them. He introduced himself as Flint, a former engineer who used his skills to maintain the life support systems on Freedonia before Razor's takeover. Flint explained that the resistance was a ragtag group of miners, engineers, and former prisoners, anyone who chafed under Razor's tyranny. They were planning a daring raid on Razor Central Hub, the facility that controlled the colony's communication and security grids. Disabling the network would cripple Razor's control and spark a full-blown rebellion. Jax volunteered his piloting skills, offering to use Lyra's escape pod for a surprise attack on the hub's weak underbelly. Flint, impressed by Jax's courage and his connection to Lyra, a known smuggler with a reputation for neutrality, accepted his offer. Days turned into weeks as Jax and Lyra prepared for the raid. Jax trained with the resistance fighters, learning guerrilla tactics and the layout of the hub. He yearned to see Han, to know if he'd survived the crash landing, but communication with other pods was impossible in the tightly controlled network. Lyra, meanwhile, secured additional weapons and smuggled explosives from disgruntled traders sympathetic to the Resistance's cause. The tension in the hidden bunker crackled with anticipation. The day of the raid arrived, cloaked in the oppressive darkness of an asteroid storm. Jax and Lyra navigated the escape pod through the asteroid field, dodging debris and dodging Razor's patrol drones. The storm provided a much-needed cover, but their small vessel wouldn't withstand a direct confrontation. They needed to be precise. As they approached the hub, a monstrous metallic structure embedded within the asteroid, a wave of fear washed over Jax. This was a gamble, a fight against impossible odds. But there was no turning back. They breached the hub's underbelly exactly as planned. The resistance fighters, armed with smuggled weapons and improvised explosives, stormed the ground floor, creating a diversion. Jax guided the escape pod through a narrow access tunnel, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Inside the hub, chaos reigned. Alarms blared, red lights flashing. Guards scrambled, confused by the sudden attack. Jax, heart pounding, located the central control room. He landed the pod with a bang, creating a smoke screen as he leaped out, weapon drawn. A fierce firefight ensued. Jax, utilizing his street smarts and the enclosed space, took down several guards. He reached the control room door, just as a hulking figure emerged, a titanium jaw glinting in the smoke. It was Razor, his face twisted in rage. A brutal hand-to-hand fight erupted. Years of pent-up anger fueled Jax's every move. He dodged Razor's brutal attacks, adrenaline masking the pain of a glancing blow. Finally, with a desperate lunge, Jax disarmed Razor, knocking him to the ground. He aimed the gun, his finger hovering on the trigger. Razor, defeated, let out a humorless chuckle.
"You think this ends here?" Even if you shut down the network, they'll crush you all.
Jax hesitated. The truth of Razor's words hung heavy in the air. This fight was just the beginning. He lowered the gun. "We'll see about that," he said, a newfound determination hardening his voice. With a nod to the stunned resistance fighters who had entered the control room, Jax, along with the remaining resistance fighters, secured the control room. Flint, his one good eye gleaming with triumph, began working on the central console. With trembling fingers, he punched in a series of codes, his brow furrowed in concentration. Moments stretched into agonizing hours. Outside, the sounds of battle raged on. The resistance fighters, emboldened by the initial success, fought with renewed fervor. But Razor's forces were numerous, and the echoing blasts of gunfire painted a grim picture. Finally, with a triumphant shout, Flint announced success. The control room flickered, and then a wave of static washed over the network. Razor's iron grip over the colony had been severed. A collective cheer erupted from the resistance fighters, a sound of hope that echoed through the metallic corridors of the hub. But their victory was short-lived. A booming voice crackled over the newly unlocked communication system. It was Razor, his voice laced with fury.
"You may have taken the hub, but this is far from over. You've just made things a lot more interesting."
The threat hung heavy in the air. They knew Razor wouldn't give up easily. He'd likely regroup, unleashing a brutal counterattack to reclaim control. Jax, his initial euphoria replaced by a grim determination, looked at Flint. "What's the plan now?" Flint, ever the strategist, outlined their next move. They would use the freed communication network to rally the rest of the colony. Miners, engineers, anyone who yearned for freedom would be called upon to join the fight. The hub, now a symbol of rebellion, would become their central command. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. Jax, utilizing his piloting skills, broadcasted a message across the colony, detailing Razor's tyranny and their fight for freedom. His voice, raw with emotion, resonated with the downtrodden miners who had long suffered under Razor's rule. Slowly, but surely, the tide began to turn. Disgruntled miners, emboldened by the Resistance's success, abandoned their workstations, grabbing any makeshift weapons they could find. Engineers, remembering their skills in sabotage, began disrupting Razor's remaining communication channels. The battle raged across the asteroid colony. Every corridor, every mining tunnel, became a battleground. Jax, alongside Lyra and the resistance fighters, fought with a newfound purpose. They were no longer just a ragtag group of outcasts, they were freedom fighters, defending their newfound home. Days bled into weeks. The once bustling marketplace was eerily silent, the only sound the constant crackle of gunfire and the distant rumble of explosions. Razor, cornered but not defeated, unleashed his final gambit, a horde of heavily armed cyborgs, repurposed from the derelict mining vessels. The cyborgs were relentless, tearing through the resistance lines with brutal efficiency. Jax, witnessing the carnage, knew this was their defining moment. He looked at Lyra, a silent question hanging in the air. With a determined nod, they devised a desperate plan. Lyra, drawing upon her smuggling expertise, knew the layout of the abandoned mining vessels. Jax, piloting the escape pod with reckless abandon, weaved through the asteroid field, leading the cyborgs on a wild chase. He lured them into the derelict vessel where Lyra had rigged a series of explosive charges. With a heart-stopping roar, the derelict vessel erupted in a ball of fire, taking the cyborgs with it. The explosion sent a shockwave through the asteroid, a turning point in the battle. Razor's last hope lay shattered amidst the debris. News of the cyborgs' destruction spread like wildfire. Razor's remaining forces, demoralized and leaderless, began to surrender. The resistance, fueled by a surge of victory, pressed their advantage, finally cornering Razor in his heavily fortified command center. Jax, along with Flint and a small group of fighters, stormed the command center. A final confrontation ensued, a desperate struggle between a man clinging to power and those yearning for freedom. In the end, it was Jax, determined by the memory of his cramped cell and the hope for a better future, who disarmed Razor. Razor, defeated and broken, was taken into custody. The long night of oppression was finally over. As the first rays of sunlight peeked through the artificial sky of the asteroid colony, a sense of cautious optimism filled the air. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding Freedonia from the ashes of war would be a monumental task. But for Jax, standing amidst the cheers of the liberated colonists, a sense of peace settled over him. He wasn't just a fugitive anymore.